You wanted the full story on Tyron McAlpin, and this is not an easy one to unpack.
Yeah.
We're talking about a case where the initial police report and what you see in the body cam footage, they tell very different stories, you know?
Right. And from the start, like right away, you know, it's important to remember we're talking about a situation that should have been, you know, a routine interaction.
Right.
And instead it becomes this really disturbing display of force.
It does. And it's impossible, I think, to ignore the fact that McAlpin is deaf and has cerebral palsy. Like that context, it really frames this whole encounter, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, you know, it makes you think about police conduct and, you know, whether there was any implicit bias at play here, you know, so.
Definitely. So let's rewind to the beginning of this, though. We have the police report.
Yeah.
And the report claims that McAlpin was a threat, that he took a fighting stance.
Yeah.
But then you look at the surveillance footage, you look at the body cam footage. What are we actually seeing in these videos?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what's so striking, you know, because when you see the footage, it really does contradict these initial claims by the police.
Yeah.
You see McAlpin walking down the street. He's talking on his cell phone.
Right.
He even seems to try to go around the police car. Like, he's not even trying to confront them at all.
It's a far cry from an immediate attack. I mean, this sounds like, you know, an everyday situation that just went very wrong and very quickly.
Yeah.
So how did things escalate so drastically?
Well, I think this is where McAlpin's disabilities really become a critically important part of this whole story, right?
Yeah.
Imagine for a second being deaf and having cerebral palsy.
Right.
I mean, your ability to understand and then respond to commands, especially in a stressful situation, is going to be very different, you know, than someone who doesn't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It makes you wonder, you know, watching these videos, if the officers involved even, like, tried to recognize, let alone adapt to, how McAlpin's disabilities might have, I don't know, like, influenced how he was behaving, how he was acting.
Yeah, and I think that's really the heart of the matter, right? Because the videos show this very, very rapid escalation.
Yes.
From just verbal commands to them using physical violence against him.
Yeah.
And there's really no, like, there's no pause, you know, where they seem to recognize that maybe he's not willfully disobeying them, but maybe he's actually just physically unable to comply with what they're shouting at him, you know?
It's hard to watch, and it's incredibly difficult to watch the footage of the officers using force against him, especially like the repeated punching, the tasing while he's already on the ground.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to reconcile that with any idea, any concept of what someone would call necessary force.
Yeah, and it's especially tough to watch because this is where his wife enters the picture.
Right.
Jessica Ulasek, she arrives and, you know, she sees what's happening and she immediately tries to de-escalate everything, right, by telling the officers about McAlpin's disabilities.
Right.
And she's, you know... She's
trying to help, you know, trying to advocate for her husband. And you would hope that, I don't know, in that moment, the officers would listen.
Yeah, and this is where it gets, you know, even more disturbing. Yeah. Because, you know, Ulasek, she tells them, right, that McAlpin is deaf and has cerebral palsy.
Right.
And she even says, like, he wouldn't have assaulted anyone, you know? Yeah. And the officer's response, which is caught on the body cam footage, is just, it's chilling. He says, well, he did now.
It's hard to hear. And it makes you think about how McAlpin's disabilities were perceived in that moment, you know, or really like disregarded basically throughout this entire encounter.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder, like, were his disabilities mistaken for non-compliance?
Right.
Or even like aggression, you know?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, what does that say about the training that these officers had or the awareness surrounding these types of situations?
For sure. It's a crucial question. And it also brings us to the legal challenges, right, that were raised by McAlpin's lawyer.
Right.
They argued that what happened, was a clear violation of his Fourth Amendment rights.
Okay.
So can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean in this particular case?
Yeah, sure. So the Fourth Amendment, it protects us, individuals, from what's called unreasonable search and seizure.
Right.
So the big question here, right, is, did the police have what is considered reasonable suspicion to detain McAlpin in the first place?
And reasonable suspicion, you know, that sounds like it implies there was some sort of objective evidence.
Exactly.
That McAlpin was actually doing something criminal.
Exactly, yeah. It can't just be a hunch, you know. They need a real concrete basis for stopping someone, you know.
Right.
And so if we're looking at the footage, McAlpin's walking, he's talking on his phone.
Right.
Would a reasonable person watching that would they suspect criminal activity?
Okay.
That's, I think, a big point of contention in this whole case, right?
It seems like a really important one, because if the initial stop, if that was not even justified,
Yeah.
then everything after that, the escalation, the use of force, I mean, it all kind of like gets held up to even more scrutiny.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And then on top of that, you have the issue of the officer's training.
Right.
You know, especially when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities.
Unquote.
And during those preliminary hearings, their answers about the training they had were, I guess you could say, inadequate.
Okay.
One officer couldn't even remember the training from years prior, and the other one admitted that it was really brief and he didn't remember much of it at all.
It's alarming to hear, to say the least. It makes you wonder about, what are the systemic gaps that we're seeing in properly preparing law enforcement, to handle these situations with more sensitivity, more awareness.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about, well, I mean, one, the need for that training, but also, like, are there consequences for not remembering it, for not adhering to it? Yeah, definitely. And I think, it brings up this bigger question of, like, accountability, right? Like, if there are these gaps in training, or if someone's not following the established protocols, how do we make sure that there are consequences for that? And then how do we actually prevent something like this from happening all over again?
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
And we know that this case, sparked a lot of outrage. There were calls for justice from disability rights groups, organizations like the NAACP.
Right.
What was the public's response to all of this, and how did that maybe even influence what ended up happening?
Yeah, I think, it definitely struck a nerve with a lot of people, and it became this, like, flashpoint for these bigger conversations about police conduct, about disability rights, and these bigger systemic issues that we see that lead to these sorts of encounters in the first place. So
Absolutely. And in terms of, like, the legal outcome of the case, you mentioned charges were brought against McAlpin. What actually happened? What was the final outcome?
Well, ultimately, the county attorney, they actually decided to drop all the charges against Tara McAlpin.
Wow.
So that's the assault charge, the resisting arrest, even the initial theft accusation that led to the police stopping him in the first place.
Okay, so a victory for McAlpin and his family, but I mean, was there ever an explanation given for why they dropped the charges?
That's the thing. It's still kind of unclear.
Okay.
The county attorney, they said that they had done a thorough review of everything. They met with community leaders, considered all the evidence,
Right.
but they never actually gave specific reasons for why they made that decision.
So it's like there's a sense of justice, maybe, but without that transparency, it's hard to, like, fully understand what the reasoning was behind it,
Yeah, it does. It leaves us with some unanswered questions for sure.
It does, and I think it makes you think about, like, the bigger picture of accountability, of public trust.
Right.
Because if we don't have clear explanations for these decisions, then you start to lose faith in the systems that are supposed to be there to protect you.
Absolutely. It highlights how important transparency is and these open dialogues.
Yeah.
And a real commitment to learning from these incidents so they don't happen over and over again,
So where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways from this whole case, and how do we use it to create some kind of positive change?
Well, I think at the very least it shows how urgent it is to have better training, more comprehensive training for law enforcement on how to interact with people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And not just, the basics, but
Right.
really equipping officers with the tools they need.
Right.
And the empathy, frankly, to de-escalate these situations before they become volatile,
Because it's not just knowing the law. It's about, like you said, understanding the human element of this, right?
Exactly.
Recognizing that somebody's actions, they might be stemming from their disability. It's not defiance. It's not aggression. It's something else.
Exactly. It's about understanding, breaking down those stigmas, creating a world, a society where everyone feels safe and respected and understood.
Absolutely. It's a call for all of us to do better, I think, to educate ourselves, to really challenge our own assumptions, and to fight for a more just and equitable world. So thank you for, taking this deep dive with us. This has been, a difficult conversation, but an important one.
Yeah, it has been.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you a better understanding of how complex this case really is.
Yeah.
And what it means. And remember, there's always more to learn, more to discuss, and ultimately more to do to make sure that there's justice for everyone.
I agree.
Thank you for listening.